My name is Jake, and I work at a McDonald's in a small town. It's not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills, and I get to hang out with my coworkers. Most shifts are pretty uneventful. You flip burgers, clean up, take orders, and watch the clock, waiting for your shift to end. But something happened one night that I can't explain. Something that still haunts me every time I step into that restaurant. It was a Thursday night, and I had been scheduled for the graveyard shift. Not many people come to McDonald's in the middle of the night, so it's usually just a few of us working. That night, it was just me and Lily, another employee who'd been there longer than I had. She was in charge of the grill, while I handled the front counter and the drive-thru. The shift started off normal. A few late-night customers came in, mostly truckers or people just passing through town. They'd order, eat quietly, and leave. The restaurant always felt different at night, though. It was too quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, and the shadows seemed longer, creeping into every corner. Around midnight, the place was empty. I leaned against the counter, checking my phone, when Lily walked over. She had a strange look on her face. "Hey Jake, have you ever heard about what happened here a few years ago?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, what happened?" They say this place is haunted," she said, her voice low. "Some guy went missing during a shift, just disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. It's like he vanished into thin air." I laughed nervously, brushing off her story. "Yeah, right. That's just some dumb urban legend." But Lily didn't smile. "I'm serious. People say weird stuff happens here at night. Lights flicker and sometimes you can hear strange noises like someone's still working in the kitchen when no one's there." "Come on, Lily. You're just trying to freak me out." "I'm not. I've heard things myself. And I've seen things too." I didn't want to admit it, but her story gave me the chills. The thought of being alone in the restaurant with something lurking in the dark wasn't exactly comforting. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the uneasy atmosphere of the empty McDonald's was starting to get to me. At around 1 a.m., things started getting weird. I was standing at the front counter when I heard a noise from the kitchen, like a metal tray being dropped. I looked over at Lily, who was at the grill, flipping burgers. "Did you drop something?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I didn't." The noise came again. This time, it was louder, like someone was banging pots and pans together. Lily and I exchanged nervous glances. "I'm going to check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I walked into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything looked normal. The grill was still sizzling, the fryers bubbling, and all the trays were neatly stacked. But then, I heard it again, a loud clang, like something heavy being dropped in the freezer. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way to the large walk-in freezer at the back of the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure it had been closed earlier. I pushed it open slowly, the cold air hitting me as I stepped inside. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The shelves were lined with boxes of frozen patties, bags of fries, and other supplies. But as I was about to leave, I heard it, faint breathing, coming from the back of the freezer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I took a step closer, peering into the darkness at the far end of the freezer. That's when I saw it, something moving behind the boxes. It was small, like the shape of a person crouching down. "Lily, is that you?" I asked, even though I knew it couldn't be her. The figure didn't respond. It stayed completely still, as if it was waiting for something. My skin crawled with fear, and I backed out of the freezer, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I rushed back to the front, where Lily was waiting, her eyes wide. "Did you see anything?" she asked. "There's someone in the freezer," I whispered. "I don't know who or what, but something's in there." Lily looked terrified. "We need to get out of here, Jake." I nodded, but before we could leave, the drive-thru bell chimed. Someone had pulled up to the speaker outside. Lily and I stared at each other for a moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, I grabbed the headset and answered, "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" I said, my voice shaking. For a few seconds, there was only silence on the other end. Then a voice crackled through the speaker. low and distorted. I'm already inside. I ripped the headset off, my hands trembling. Lily, we need to go. Now. We didn't wait another second. We ran for the door, but as we reached it, the lights in the restaurant flickered and went out. The only light left was the dim glow from the kitchen. "We're locked in," Lily cried, tugging at the door. It wouldn't budge. I pulled up my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The whole restaurant felt wrong, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. "Jake," Lily whispered. "Look." I turned and saw what she was pointing at. In the kitchen, through the window that separated the front from the back, there was a shadowy figure standing there. It was tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and its face was hidden in darkness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us. "We have to hide," I said, grabbing Lily's arm. "Come on." We ducked behind the counter, crouching low as the figure started to move. I could hear its footsteps echoing across the tiled floor, slow and deliberate. It was looking for us. My heart pounded in my ears as we huddled together, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right on the other side of the counter. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find us. But then, the footsteps stopped. I dared to peek over the counter, just for a second, and saw that— "Where did it go?" Lily whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, but eventually, the lights flickered back on and the eerie silence returned. Slowly, we stood up, our legs shaking. "We need to get out of here," I said. Lily nodded, and we made our way to the back door, hoping it wasn't locked like the front. To our relief, it opened easily. We stepped out into the cold night air, breathing a sigh of relief. As we stood there, trying to calm down, I glanced back at the restaurant. Through the windows, I could see the empty dining area, the kitchen, and the flickering lights. Everything looked normal again, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen. Something was in that McDonald's, something not human, and whatever it was, I had a feeling it wasn't done with us. Lily quit the next day. I wanted to leave too, but I needed the money. I still work the night shift sometimes, but I'm always on edge, waiting for something to happen again. I know it's only a matter of time before it does. And when it does, I'm not sure I'll make it out alive. My name is Mark, and I've been working at McDonald's for about 6 months now. It's not the best job in the world, but it's easy money, and I get free food during my breaks. Most days I work in the afternoons or evenings, but tonight was different. Tonight I was working the graveyard shift, covering for a coworker who had called in sick. I didn't mind the late shift. I figured it would be quiet, maybe a few truckers passing through, or some teenagers grabbing burgers after a night out. I was wrong. It all started around 11:30 p.m. when I arrived at the restaurant. The manager, Mr. Thompson, handed me the keys and said he was heading home. He looked tired and annoyed, as usual. "You sure you'll be all right tonight, Mark? Sometimes the night shift can be strange," he said with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. I shrugged it off. "I'll be fine. It's just another shift, right?" He didn't answer, just nodded and left, leaving me alone in the empty restaurant. The first couple of hours were uneventful. I served a few customers in the drive-thru, cleaned up the dining area, and restocked some supplies. By 2 a.m. things had slowed down, and I was standing behind the counter, bored out of my mind. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the empty tables and chairs. The silence was almost comforting, but at the same time it felt unnatural. Around 2:30 a.m., the first weird thing happened. I was wiping down the counter when I heard a noise from the kitchen, a faint clanging sound like pots and pans being knocked over. I figured I had just left something on the edge of a shelf, so I went to check it out. The kitchen was dark except for the light from the grill, which was still on, keeping warm. I looked around but didn't see anything out of place. Everything seemed normal until I heard it again. This time, it was louder, like something metal scraping across the floor. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew I was the only one in the building. No answer. I walked further into the kitchen, my heart beating a little faster. The sound was coming from the walk-in freezer at the back. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the heavy metal door. I had no reason to be afraid, but something about the sound, the silence afterward, made me uneasy. I reached for the freezer handle and pulled it open. Cold air rushed out, fogging up my glasses for a moment. I peered inside, but there was nothing, just boxes of frozen patties, bags of fries, and some desserts. The shelves were neatly organized, just like I had left them earlier. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself, closing the freezer door and heading back to the front. But the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the idea that I wasn't alone in the restaurant anymore. At around 3 a.m., the drive-through bell chimed. Finally, I thought, a customer to distract me from whatever weirdness was going on. I grabbed my headset and greeted the person. "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" There was no response, just silence. "Hello?" I tried again. Still nothing. I figured the headset might have glitched, so I checked the screen that shows if a car is at the speaker. But when I looked, there was no car. The drive-through lane was completely empty. I took off the headset and looked out the window, squinting into the darkness. There was no one out there. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a technical issue, maybe a false signal from the system. But that uneasy feeling kept growing. The restaurant, which had felt quiet and peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. At 3:15 a.m. I heard the sound again, the clanging from the kitchen. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It wasn't just a random noise. It was like someone was moving things around back there, trying to get my attention. I walked to the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly. The sound grew louder as I got closer, coming from the back area near the freezer again. I stopped in front of the freezer door, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder than usual, like the chill was seeping through the metal door. Taking a deep breath, I opened the freezer. This time, the shelves weren't as neatly organized as before. Some of the boxes had been knocked over, and the bags of fries were scattered across the floor. But that wasn't what caught my attention. There were footprints in the frost, wet, heavy footprints, like someone had been walking through the freezer. They led from the back of the freezer to the door and stopped right in front of where I was standing. I froze. My mind raced. There was no way anyone else could have been in here. The restaurant had been locked up since Mr. Thompson left, and even if someone had snuck in, I would have heard them by now. The footprints were fresh. Whoever or whatever had made them was still close by. I slammed the freezer door shut and backed away, my pulse racing. I needed to get out of here, but I couldn't just leave the store unattended. I decided to call the police, just to be safe. I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed, but before I could press call, the lights in the restaurant flickered. Once, twice, then they went out completely. I stood there in the dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. My phone screen lit up my face as I stared at it, my hands shaking. Suddenly, I heard a noise, soft at first, then louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the kitchen. My heart raced as I turned towards the sound. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I knew someone was there. The footsteps got closer, echoing across the tile floor. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I backed up towards the front door, fumbling with my keys. I needed to get out, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the keys on the floor. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard something else, a low, raspy breathing. It was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just darkness and the empty restaurant. I grabbed the keys and ran to the front door, throwing it open and rushing outside. The cold night air hit my face, and I gasped for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes, trying to calm down. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and I couldn't stop shaking. I looked back at the restaurant, its windows dark and still. Nothing moved inside, but I knew I wasn't imagining what had happened. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave the place open, but there was no way I was going back inside alone. Finally, I called Mr. Thompson. He answered after a few rings, sounding groggy. "Mark, what's going on?" Thing as quickly as I could, the noises, the footprints, the footsteps in the dark. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long pause. "Mark," he said finally, his voice low, "you need to get out of there, now." "I'm already outside," I replied, my voice shaking. "Good. Don't go back in. I'll come by and lock up. Just go home." I didn't ask any questions. I just got in my car and left. The next day, I quit. I never went back to that McDonald's, and I still don't know what happened that night. But sometimes when I drive past the restaurant, I get that same uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that something is still in there, waiting for the next unlucky person to work the night shift. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know. But whatever it wasn't human. My name is David, and I never thought that a job at McDonald's could turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I was 19 years old when I got the job. I had just graduated high school and wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. College wasn't for me, and I wasn't in a rush to figure out my career. So, when I saw the McDonald's near my house was hiring, I applied. The pay was decent, and it was only a 15-minute walk from home. Plus, I figured working the night shifts wouldn't be too bad. Less customers, fewer things to do. How hard could it be? I got the job pretty easily. The manager, Tom, was an easygoing guy in his early 30s. He barely asked me any questions during the interview, just said, "You'll start tomorrow night." And that was it. I didn't mind. It seemed simple enough, and I needed the money. The first few nights were as boring as I expected. There were only a few customers here and there. Most of them were either teenagers looking for a late-night snack or truckers passing through town. I'd stand behind the counter, flipping burgers or refilling the fryer oil, just waiting for my shift to end. It was a routine, and after a while, I got used to the quiet. But things started to change one night in late October. It was around 2 a.m., and I was the only one in the restaurant. Tom usually left around midnight, leaving me and a janitor named Carlos to close up. Carlos, though, had called in sick, so it was just me that night. I didn't mind the solitude, but there was this weird feeling in the air, like the building itself was alive, watching me. I tried to ignore it, and went about my usual tasks. I wiped down the counters, cleaned the tables, and made sure everything was stocked for the morning crew. The clock ticked slowly as I kept glancing at it, wishing for time to speed up. That's when I heard it. A soft, faint tapping noise coming from the back storage room. It was so light that at first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it happened again. Tap, 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 like someone lightly knocking on a door. I paused, my hands gripping the cleaning cloth tightly. The storage room was always locked, and no one besides Tom and I had the key. I figured maybe a rat had gotten in or something, so I grabbed a broom and headed to the back. The storage room door was closed, just as I expected. I pressed my ear against it, listening for any more sounds, but there was nothing. Just silence. I stood there for a few seconds before unlocking the door and swinging it open. The room was empty. I scanned the shelves filled with boxes of napkins, ketchup packets, and frozen patties. Everything was in its place, untouched. No signs of rats, no strange noises, nothing. I let out a breath and laughed at myself for being so paranoid. I was probably just hearing things. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to the front counter. But the uneasy feeling lingered, hanging over me like a shadow. Every creak of the floor or hum of the freezer seemed louder than usual, and I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. As I tried to focus on my tasks, a loud bang echoed through the restaurant. I jumped, my heart racing. It came from the back again, but this time it wasn't a soft tapping. It was a heavy metallic crash, like something had fallen off a shelf. Grabbing the broom again, I rushed to the storage room, my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The crash had been too loud for something small, and I was starting to feel like maybe there was more to this than I'd originally thought. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was still empty. but one of the shelves had collapsed, its contents scattered across the floor. Boxes of paper cups and plastic lids lay in a heap, along with a few bags of frozen fries. I stepped closer, kneeling down to pick them up, when something caught my eye. There, in the middle of the mess, was a single McDonald's Happy Meal toy. It was a small plastic figure of Ronald McDonald, grinning up at me with that eerie painted smile. I hadn't seen one of those in years. They stopped giving out toys like this a long time ago. Confused, I picked it up. It felt cold and strange in my hand, like it had been sitting there for ages, untouched. I couldn't understand how it got there. I hadn't seen any of these in the storage room before, and there was no reason for it to be lying in the middle of a pile of boxes. I placed it on the shelf and quickly cleaned up the rest of the mess. The uneasy feeling was growing stronger by the minute, and I couldn't wait to get out of there. I finished my shift without any more incidents, but that night stayed with me. The next day, I mentioned the strange occurrences to Tom. He laughed it off, saying it was probably just the old building settling or a random coincidence. "Stuff like that happens sometimes," he said, shrugging. "Don't let it freak you out." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That Happy Meal toy, the noises from the storage room, it all felt too strange to be nothing. A few nights later, things got worse. It was another quiet night, with no customers for hours. I was standing behind the counter, scrolling through my phone when the lights flickered. They only went out for a second, but it was long enough to make my stomach tighten with fear. I looked around, waiting for the lights to go out again, but they stayed on. I told myself it was just a power surge, nothing to worry about. But then the kitchen door creaked open, slowly, as if someone was pushing it from the other side. I froze. The kitchen was supposed to be empty. I hadn't gone back there in at least an hour, and no one else was in the building. Cautiously, I moved towards the door, peeking inside. The fryers and grills were all turned off, the lights buzzing softly above. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing, a single bright red balloon floating in the middle of the kitchen. It was just there, bobbing slightly in the air, as if it had been tied to something. But there were no strings, no decorations, just this lone balloon, swaying gently. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The longer I looked, the more I realized that something was very wrong with this place. I didn't know where the balloon came from, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I backed away, slowly, and returned to the front counter, trying to ignore the fact that the balloon was still floating there, just beyond the kitchen door. I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to move, but it didn't. It just stayed there, unnervingly still. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran out of the building. The cold night air felt like a relief after the stifling tension inside. I didn't even look back as I walked home. The next night, I was dreading my shift, but I couldn't exactly quit without a better job lined up. I needed the money, so I went back, hoping things would be normal again. But they weren't. As soon as I entered the restaurant, I felt that same unsettling presence. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was watching me. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to that red balloon, the strange noises, the Happy Meal toy. Halfway through my shift, I decided to check the storage room again. I wasn't sure why. I guess part of me wanted to prove to myself that everything was fine, that I was just overreacting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my heart racing. At first, everything looked normal. The shelves were stocked, the boxes were neatly stacked, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, I saw it. The same Ronald McDonald toy, lying on the floor in the exact same spot as before. My blood ran cold. I had put that toy back on the shelf days ago. There was no way it could have fallen again, especially in the same position. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat, and then, without thinking, I reached down to pick it up. As soon as my fingers touched the plastic, the lights in the storage room went out. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to guide me out of there as quickly as possible. When I reached the front of the restaurant, the lights were still on. The storage room was the only place that had gone dark. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't explain any of it. The noises, the balloon, the toy. It all felt like some kind of nightmare, but I was wide awake. That night, after I got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it. I thought about quitting, but something told me that if I left without getting answers, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So, the next night, I made a plan. I brought a small camera with me, one I could set up in the kitchen. If something was going on, I wanted to catch it on video. Maybe then I'd know I wasn't just losing my mind. When I got to work, I set the camera up in a corner, pointing towards the storage room. I figured if anything strange happened, it would be back there. For the first few hours, everything was normal. I kept glancing at the camera, hoping to catch something, but the screen stayed blank. Then, just after 3 a.m., the kitchen door creaked open again. I turned, my heart racing, but this time, there was no balloon, just darkness. I slowly approached the door, my hands shaking. As I stepped inside the kitchen, I heard a faint giggle, soft, eerie, like a child's laughter. I froze. The sound echoed through the empty restaurant, sending chills down my spine. And then, in the middle of the kitchen, the red balloon appeared again, floating towards me. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed the camera, sprinted out of the building, and never looked back. The next day, I quit my job. I never found out what was haunting that McDonald's, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that whatever was in there wasn't normal, and I'm just glad I got out before it got worse. Even now, months later, I sometimes hear that faint giggling in my dreams, and every time, I wake up with the image of that red balloon floating towards me, knowing that some things are better left alone. My name is Alex, and working at McDonald's was supposed to be an easy job. It's just flipping burgers and taking orders, right? At least that's what I thought when I got hired. But what happened one night changed everything for me, and now I can't even look at a McDonald's without getting chills. It started on a slow Tuesday night. I was on the closing shift, and it was just me and my manager, Greg. We didn't get many customers after 10 p.m., and by midnight the place was practically empty. Greg was in the office doing paperwork, and I was cleaning the counters, hoping to get out of there early. Around 12:30, the lights started flickering. At first, I thought it was just a power issue. This location had problems with the wiring before, and it wasn't the first time the lights had acted up. But this time, it felt different. The flickering was faster, more random, like someone was playing with the switch. "Greg, did you see that?" I called out, hoping he'd notice it too. "Yeah, probably the breaker again," he replied, sounding annoyed but not concerned. "I'll check it out in a minute." I shrugged and kept wiping down the tables. The flickering stopped for a while, and things seemed normal again. Then, around 1 a.m., the drive-through speaker crackled to life. "Hello? Is anyone there?" a deep, raspy voice asked. It didn't sound like the usual late-night customer. It sounded off, like the voice was coming from far away. I walked over to the window and pressed the button. Welcome to McDonald's. How can I help you?" There was silence for a moment, and then the voice came through again. "I'll take a Happy Meal." The way the person said Happy Meal sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't sound playful, like how someone would normally order one. It was cold, almost threatening. "We don't have Happy Meals at this hour," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there something else you'd like?" More silence. Then the lights flickered again, more violently this time, and I heard a soft knock at the window. I froze. We were supposed to be closed and no one had pulled up to the drive-thru. Slowly, I turned to look at the window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty parking lot beyond the glass. But then, there it was. A red balloon, bobbing gently in the air, floating just outside the window. I stared at it, my heart racing. The balloon had no string, nothing to hold it in place. It just hovered there, swaying slightly as if it was waiting for something, or someone. I backed away from the window, feeling a sense of dread settle in my chest. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "Greg!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. "You need to come out here." He didn't respond, so I ran to the office and banged on the door. When I opened it, Greg was slumped over his desk, completely still. "Greg?" I whispered, shaking his shoulder. No response. I checked his pulse. It was faint but there. He was breathing, but it was shallow. Something had knocked him out, but I had no idea what. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do next. Suddenly, the drive-through speaker crackled again. Come outside, Alex," the voice said, clearer this time, like it was right beside me. "I've got your Happy Meal." I didn't know how they knew my name, and I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my phone and dialed, but before I could hit call, the lights went out completely. The entire restaurant plunged into darkness, and I was left standing there with nothing but the sound of my own heavy breathing. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the back of the restaurant, where the storage room was. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone or something was in there with me. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the office door. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. But then the door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stepped into the room. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see the outline of a person, tall, with broad shoulders, standing in the doorway completely still. In one hand, it held a small square box, a Happy Meal box. "Your order's ready," the voice said, cold and distorted. I bolted for the back exit, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my chest burning and my legs aching. When I finally looked behind me, the restaurant was still there, dark and quiet, like nothing had happened. I never went back to that McDonald's. Greg was fine the next day, but he couldn't remember anything that had happened. He told me I'd probably just had a bad dream or imagined it all. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice in my head. "Your Happy Meal is ready."